Hear now the words of our Old Testament reading this morning. I read from the 34th and final chapter of Deuteronomy. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." And with his eyes on the land in front of him, Moses was terrified. For he faced not only the mountain atop which he stood to see this long distance, but he faced, in addition, a bigger mountain. The mountain of shame, which overwhelmed him. Shame from the last 40 years. The last 40 years of wandering through the wilderness, remembering again and again that God had invited he and the holy people to enter the land, but Moses and 10 of the spies said, "No, we can't do it. The giants are too big." Shame over the failure at the rock. When God had said, "Speak to the rock, and I, in my power and my authority, will cause water to gush from it." But Moses wanted the people to know that he was in charge, and so he hit the rock with his staff. The water came, but the authority looked like it was from Moses. Of course, God was disappointed and said, "Now you will not enter the land yourself." He felt the shame that had really been there from the very beginning, since God spoke to him from the bush. The shame that caused Moses to say, "Not me. I'm not smart enough. I'm not well spoken enough. I'm not the right guy. Isn't there someone else?" And then there was the shame of recognizing who he stood before, that at the bottom of the mountain stood the Israelites that for the last 40 years had been complaining and whining and wandering like lost puppies. And now these are the folks that God says, "Go on in. The promised land is yours." It was the shame that he felt about where he came from that washed over him, along with all the shame of his life and all the shame of who he was, that caused him to make a decision on top of that mountain. Even though his eyesight was failing and his body was weak, he had the strength to go down the mountain again and turn to the tribes of Israel and say, "Pack up, it's time to go back to the desert. Back to the safety we know. Back to where we've been the last 40 years. Back to the good old days." And so he told the 12 tribes, and each of them packed up, and they went into the desert where they stayed. They set up camp once more because they knew how to do that. They knew how to live in the wilderness. And so there they stayed until the moment that Moses lived no more. And around his bed and around his tent and around the place where he had died, they made a shrine to remember, to grieve the one that had led them, to grieve the death of what had been possible, to grieve the good old days. And around that shrine, around that place of grief, there they stayed, and there they lived, and there they wasted away in the desert. And 12 tribes became 8. And 8 tribes became 3. And 3 became 1. And finally, there was just one man left, old Joshua, who sat down in the dust. David had never been born. Solomon had never been dreamed of. There was no temple that had been built, for they never went in to the land of promise. And so in the blowing sand, Joshua looked vaguely to the west, trying to remember the stories of his youth, of a land flowing with milk and honey. The story could have ended that way. Of course it didn't. But how close could it have been to Moses ending the story? How quickly could he have changed the minds of the people? How simple could it have been that everything could have been so different? All because on Moses lay this life of shame. When we speak of shame, I think it's helpful to look at those who have talked about research and talked about ways that shame has made a difference in our lives. One of the resources that I look to often is Brene Brown, who has written about shame and written about vulnerability. She's a researcher. She's somebody that likes good, cold, hard facts and spreadsheets and very clear things. But what she's done is take her research methods and talked about things that are a little more touchy-feely. What did Joe say in his prayer? Warm and fuzzy. Things that are a little bit less easy to quantify. Things like shame, things like creativity. And through her work and through her interviews with individuals as a social worker and as a researcher, she has come up with some fascinating conclusions about the reality of shame in our lives. Now, she makes an important distinction and definition about what shame is. A distinction between shame and guilt. Guilt, she says, is feeling bad about something that we've done. Shame, on the other hand, is feeling bad about who we are. Oftentimes they are related. We can feel guilt about things, but there can come a point where the guilt waves over us, and all of a sudden it is about us. And the shame of who we are overwhelms us. And how quickly this could have happened to Moses as well. Brene Brown says when we deal with this kind of shame, when we deal with this, and all of us do at some level, all of us have some level of understanding of shame within us. We have to deal with things about who we are and where we have come from. She names 12 different shame categories that make sense, right? About our body and our body images. Shame about our family history. Shame about money. Shame about our parenting ability, or maybe even our lack of ability to be a parent. Shame about aging and what changes in our lives. These are categories, along with many more, that all of us face. That we all have this deep question of, should I feel bad for who I am? Shame is as old as Moses. And as recent as you or I looking in the mirror this morning. Shame is deep and shame is difficult. But she says you have to face it. What she's found in her research, the people that are healthy and react in healthy ways to shame develop what she calls a shame resilience, not resistance, not a lack of shame. She says it's always going to be there, but we must be resilient in the face of it. So she talks about the power of this shame resilience, of moving beyond it, to know that there is something deep about who we are that makes us whole, that makes us worthy. And again, this is not a new concept, but one of the other stories that we read this morning shows that story once again in the woman at the well. It is the story of the power of Jesus to name this very reality of shame resilience. For here is this woman who came to the well in the middle of the day because her shame was so great. She could not be seen with the other women who came at different times. And so in a conversation with Jesus, here is this woman with this shame heaped upon her, and what does Jesus say to her? He offers her living water. Again and again, when Jesus encounters people like this, the prostitute that anointed him, the tax collector who was an enemy of the people, again and again, Jesus says these things, offers living water. Do not be afraid. You are loved. You are forgiven. And brings about a resilience to their shame. And so, as you and I look in the mirrors tonight, as we look at the mirror in the morning, may we know that it's not about the messages that are heaped upon us in the back of our minds. It's not about trying to escape shame by numbing ourselves from it with alcohol or with drugs or with sports or with hobbies or whatever. It's not about becoming a perfectionist so that we can be better than our shame, that we can overcome it that way. It's not about cynicism. It's not about shielding ourselves from it, says Brown. It's about resilience in the midst of it. And so, I pray that you know that you are loved. That you know that you are forgiven. That you know that God is greater than your shame. But she goes on, Brown does, to talk about the fact that this is not only an individual concept, but also a communal concept. It's something that affects organizations as well. She actually quotes Peter Sheehan, who works with organizations, in order to cultivate their creativity and innovation. And Sheehan says this. He says, the secret killer of innovation is shame. You cannot measure it, but it is there. Every time someone holds back on a new idea, you can be sure shame played a part. Shame becomes fear. Fear leads to risk aversion. Risk aversion kills innovation. And so I think these words are wise as we look at our institutions, our organizations, even the reality of the church, our denomination, our own congregation. How easy is it for us to look at the statistics and feel shame? Once again, I read more articles this week talking about the demise of the church. The reality that now folks for the Center of Healthy Churches are saying that 90% of churches are losing money and losing congregation members. 90%. We read these statistics again and again, and it's difficult to hear. It's downright terrifying. However, we have a choice whether we will make these statistics a part of who we are and a part of our psyche, or will we ask, perhaps God is inviting us to be unashamed. God is inviting us to look to the future. God is inviting us to look beyond those statistics and ask, what is God doing in our midst? The way that we've talked about this in the past few years is with the 4 W's. That we are a church that welcomes. That we are a church that worships. That we are a church that works. That we are a church that wonders. And so now, as we are on the cusp of a new year, as we're starting to look at the pledge campaign, as we're starting to look at our budgeting for next year, as we're starting to look at nominating at who is going to fill the roles of our leadership, as we look at our goals for the next year, as we look at who we are and where we're going, the question that remains, will we hide in a mountain of shame, or will we ask God to lead us into a new and innovative future? We can fall prey to shame, which begets fear, which begets a lack of innovation, or we can say, God is doing something new in this place. And so we will ask, how can we welcome in innovative and creative and radical ways? Look into our neighborhood, look into the people around us, and ask God, how can we minister to them, inviting them to be a part of what we're doing? How can we worship in innovative and radical ways? You know, we blow a lot of minds, a lot of stereotypes when people walk into a Baptist church and say, you don't look like a lot of Baptists that I've hung out with in the past. And so we, in our worship service, say it's okay for us to wear pulpit robes and light a Christ candle. This is how we worship. And so we work. We work in innovative and creative and radical ways, from our partnership with Dezo to the ways that we're leading as one of the leading voices in the justice ministry, fighting against injustice here in Lawrence, to ways that we bring people into our place for Family Promise and for the food pantry. And finally, we choose to wonder in ways that are innovative and creative and radical, from our 5 points to our teaching model, as we become a leader, as we become a way that other churches look to us to see how we are doing it. We have an option, as Moses did. As we stand on the cusp of a new year and a new generation and a new idea, will we run back to the desert? Will we run back to the good old days? Or will we ask God, what is coming next? You know, Moses stood on top of that mountain, and he heard some statistics too. I'm sure somebody pointed out, 100% of the time that we've tried to go into the promised land, it has not worked well. Do you know, Moses, that we have a 1 in 1,000 chance of walking into that promised land without any challenges or without any difficulties or without anybody that doesn't want us to be there? And Moses, I think it's about 93% of people who would rather not die going into the promised land, as opposed to those who would rather maybe just go back into the desert for a little while, or maybe just instead go back to Egypt. And so he faced the statistics. He faced the reality of a difficult future, but this is what he did. He did not go back to the desert. He did not go quietly, but instead, he gathered the people and he told them it's time to go. He blessed them. He blessed Joshua as their leader, and he sent them into a new day. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had unabated. May that be the reality of our lives today. May we look to the story of Moses to tell us that is what God is doing for us. As we stand on the edge of a new day, of a new year, of new possibilities, may we stand with the vigor and the sight of what God is doing. Now, look at what happened when Moses died. They did not fail to be thankful. They did not fail to grieve. But on one hand, they grieved what was in the past. They grieved what had brought them to that place. They grieved the one who had opened the door for them. But then they walked through the door together. May we hold both in our hands, a grief and a mourning for ways that have gone in the past, but look to the future for what God is doing now. May our vision and our vigor be unabated as we look to what God is doing in our congregation, in our denomination, in the church as a whole. As we walk out of these doors, may we see the mission field that lies in front of us, the land of promise that lies in front of us, as we gather together to lead one another, to give in generosity, to worship, to be who we are. May we see God at work in the midst of the challenges and the giants that we face. May our vision and our vigor be stronger day by day. Let us pray. Lord, for the strength that you give us, for the vigor and the vision and the sight that you have shown us, we are indeed thankful. As you lead us into new and creative and innovative ways to do ministry, as you lead us into a new land of promise, may we have the strength to follow your call. May we have the hope that you are indeed lying in front of our path. And may we have the anticipation and not the shame to know that you indeed have created us for this moment and this work. In your name we pray. Amen.